Hello, and welcome to this online question and answer announcing a new collaboration between Venatorx Pharmaceuticals and the Global Antibiotic Research and Development Partnership, or GARDP, to accelerate the development of cefepime taniborbactam, a novel treatment for multi-drug resistant bacterial infections. My name is Jennifer Katz, Director of External Affairs at GARDP, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Joining me from Pennsylvania, USA, is Dr. Christopher Burns, President and CEO of Venatorx Pharmaceuticals. From Geneva, Switzerland, Dr. Manika Balasegram, Executive Director of GARDP, and Dr. Yogandri Ramessi, a pathologist specializing in clinical microbiology and antibiotic resistance with South Africa's National Health Laboratory Services, who joins us from Durban. Dr. Ramessi is also affiliated with the Antimicrobial Research Unit at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, currently pursuing a PhD focused on triangulating the molecular epidemiology of carbapenem-resistant Enterobacterales in the One Health context. Before we begin the question and answer session, I wanted to give Manika, Chris, and Yogandri an opportunity to briefly introduce themselves and provide some background about what this collaboration is working to achieve, as well as the context for why it is essential now. Manika, why don't you go first?
Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Manika Balasegram, and I'm the Executive Director of GARDP, and I'm a medical doctor by background. I'd just like to say a few words about our serious bacterial infections program, which is the newest program that GARDP has launched. And really this partnership is really the first important partnership in this program. Serious bacterial infections are a major cause of death and disability for people in hospitals and healthcare settings around the world. And drug resistance is increasingly making these infections difficult to treat. We believe in GARDP that due to the complexity of these infections and how to manage these infections and how to also develop treatments for these infections, that no single country or company or organization can address this challenge alone. It can be done in partnerships, and we believe public-private partnerships are a very important way of doing this, which is indeed why we as a largely public-funded organization are collaborating with Venatorx to accelerate the development of a new treatment for multi-drug resistant infections. In regards to why Venatorx, well, this partnership is about tackling a critical unmet need and particularly filling a gap, a gap that is unmet. This partnership will be working to accelerate the development of the phase 3 trial, of which we will be supporting the activities that Venatorx will be undertaking here for the phase 3 and registration. But GARDP will also take on the responsibility for trials and the pharmaceutical development activities to evaluate cefepime taniborbactam as a treatment for adults with multi-drug resistant infections, as well as trials to evaluate treatments for children, including babies with serious bacterial infections. So indeed, importantly, GARDP and Venatorx will work not just on the research and development, but to ensure access globally after this.
Thank you. Chris?
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Burns, the founder, one of the co-founders, president and CEO of Venatorx. My background is organic chemistry. I have a PhD in organic chemistry from MIT, and I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry for about 30 years now. First in research, and now really at the interface of research and business. You know, cefepime taniborbactam, you know, very interesting new product or product opportunity. It's a well-known cephalosporin, cefepime, arguably the most powerful cephalosporin for gram-negatives. And it's a novel beta-lactamase inhibitor, taniborbactam, which we invented at Venatorx some years ago with the support from the NIH in the United States. As Manika mentioned, the compound is currently in phase 3 for complicated urinary tract infections. We have plans to take it into respiratory infections as well as resistant, carbapenem-resistant pathogen studies and pediatric studies. It's currently being developed in partnership with the NIH, with the Wellcome Trust in London, and with BARDA in the United States. And now with this partnership, we can further expand and accelerate development of this agent into patients. We think of the drug or the drug possibility as the next generation. It's really the next generation of so-called BL-BLI, beta-lactam, beta-lactamase inhibitor combination products. It fills really a growing unmet medical need for bacteria that express or co-express different kinds of resistance enzymes, serine and metallo, beta-lactamase enzymes, and it can be helpful for Pseudomonas. It can be helpful for Klebsiella, E. coli, other gram-negative infections that are very difficult to treat now. So in the lab right now, this would be the best in class, the most potent and broadest coverage of any BL-BLI agent in development, and that can be very important when you're not sure what you're dealing with, out there in the real world, as frequently can be the case. We imagine that we can just identify what we're dealing with and pick the right drug, but often a physician is blind and time is tight. And when you have broad, powerful coverage, it can be really a relief for the care provider.
Thank you, Chris. Yugandhari?
Thank you. Good day. I'm Yugendri Ramsamy, and I'm a medical doctor with a specialization in clinical microbiology, with a master's and fellowship in microbiology, and I practice as a clinical microbiologist at a district hospital in KZN, South Africa, and I'm also doing research into antimicrobial resistance, specifically looking at carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae or Enterobacteriales. And essentially coming from that background, both as Manika and Christopher have alluded, this actually meets an unmet need, this sort of drug, because as a practicing clinical microbiologist at the side of the patient, very often now we find ourselves in a place where our carbapenems are no longer becoming an effective option due to the rise and increase in antibiotic resistance. So therefore, this particular drug that we will be discussing today is something that is going to definitely assist the clinician, going to definitely save lives, and if used properly, it could very well actually meet many of the answers that most of us are looking for in terms of therapeutics for patient. Obviously, this will go hand in hand with other interventions to address AMR globally, but to meet the need of antibiotics or antimicrobials for the future, a drug like this looks like it would benefit millions the world over, especially when it comes to the state that we're in with the dwindling situation of antimicrobials, and specifically with your broader spectrum of antibiotics. Obviously, we have the challenge of overuse when it does become available. So hence, it's very important that along with the message of a new potential antibacterial that's coming to the market, or that's coming to the market, people need to be educated on how we use it properly and effectively, with the aim of actually saving that particular antibiotic for longer term, longer period of years. Because as we know, when antibiotics come into the market, it's just a matter of time before we get resistance developing. So it's also equally important for both clinicians and microbiologists and people in general that are exposed to the drug to know that we need to use it responsibly as well.
Great, thanks to all of you for those introductions. So I'd like to turn now to our first question, which I want to direct to Yugandhari. The CDC estimates 1.7 million hospitalized patients in the United States acquire an infection each year. Drug resistance is making these infections more difficult to treat, with between 39% and 51% of bacteria causing surgical site infections now resistant to commonly used antibiotics. What do we know about the burden of serious bacterial infections, including in healthcare facilities, in low and middle income countries? And what are the challenges of tackling these infections in lower resource settings?
Okay, thanks, Jennifer. With regards to hospital-acquired infections, there are things that we do know and there are things that we don't know, especially when it comes to a low resource setting institution, because number one, there's a dearth of data that's available due to the fact that we don't have adequate surveillance systems, or if there are surveillance systems that are in place, there's a lack of standardization. Therefore, we actually don't really have a true picture of what exactly is happening with healthcare associated infections, particularly in Africa. But what we do know is that from publications and the latest WHO reports that are out there, estimate that healthcare associated infections are between 5.7 to about 19%, which actually we can't really reflects the true picture of what's happening at this very point in time. But what I can say is that a country, for example, like South Africa, that's a low middle income country, there's some surveillance work that we've been doing, and some of the latter publications that have come out looking at resistant pathogens, and in particular carbapenem resistance. There was a 5-year surveillance study that we did looking at carbapenem resistance in Enterobacteriales, and we found 2011, 2016, we almost saw around 6% CRE rate in Klebsiella. And within a spite of a year, when we looked at the data again in 2017, we saw that there was this massive jump to about 16%. So even when you are literally at bedside and giving a patient a result from a clinical micro perspective, you actually are seeing the larger numbers that are coming out of CREs in particular. And whilst we have formally reported it, because it's difficult to actually have standardized reporting in our setting, we are actually seeing the increase in numbers. Even through our daily reporting. But what we are aiming to do as low and middle income countries is we strategizing and we put infrastructure in place that are the start of surveillance systems within these countries.
Thank you. I have a question on carbapenem resistance. How has resistance to the carbapenem class of antibiotics developed? What are the challenges of developing a treatment that is active against a carbapenem-resistant pathogen? And as a follow-up, how does cefepime-taniborbactam overcome these hurdles, and what differentiates it from other treatments? Chris, would you like to respond to this question?
Sure. So, first to the question of how resistance develops. Obviously, we don't want to go too deep into the weeds, but maybe the way to think about it is that in general, we accept that we must treat serious infections with antibiotics. But inevitably, the bacteria, which are very resilient, they slowly develop resistance against just about any class of antibiotics. So for the last 30 years, we have been using penicillins, cephalosporins, and fluoroquinolones in order to address particularly resistant gram-negative infections. But sort of as night follows day, the bacteria have developed resistance to the penicillins, the cephalosporins, and cross-resistance to the quinolones. And that has birthed the heavy usage of carbapenems in order to have something to treat the patient. And now we begin to see that the bacteria have begun to figure out the carbapenems. So in that case, what the bacteria do, particularly in gram-negative bacteria, is they produce enzymes. And these enzymes are called beta-lactamase enzymes. and they can have a serine or a metallo or a metal in its main active area. And these enzymes basically destroy carbapenems. So as the carbapenem arrives, in order to kill the bacteria kill the carbapenem. They inactivate it chemically, and the carbapenem can no longer arrive at the site that it needs to bind to in order to kill the bacteria. So that's the mechanism. The bacteria produce beta-lactamase enzymes, serine and metallo-based, in order to inactivate carbapenem antibiotics. So now to the question of how we at Venatorx tackled this issue and basically what we've come up with. So the challenge for us was to inactivate their inactivator. It was to turn off these enzymes that are destroying the beta-lactam antibiotics, it could be carbapenems or other beta-lactam antibiotics. And the way we did that is to invent taniborbactam. And what makes taniborbactam unique is that it has the broadest spectrum of activity, at least at this stage of development, across all the key enzymes. It covers the serines and the metallos, which is unique. No other agent can do that. And by combining it with cefepime, the powerful cephalosporin antibiotic, we basically turn off the resistance mechanism with the taniborbactam, which allows the cefepime to arrive at its target and kill the bacteria. What's really nice about this is that cefepime is a very highly trusted agent across gram-negatives. The physicians like it. It's safe, it's effective. It's effective against Pseudomonas. It's effective against Klebsiella. It's effective against E. coli. So by protecting it, we allow it to go back to what it once was before the bacteria figured out how to produce enzymes to destroy it. And that's what taniborbactam does. If it's approved, we hope that clinicians would view it worldwide as a new, safe, and effective and trusted therapeutic option for as carbapenem resistance continues to grow.
Thank you, Chris. Gokundry, as a pathologist with experience in intensive care units, what is it you are looking for in a target product profile for a treatment for serious bacterial infections, particularly in lower resource settings?
So I think the vital aspects when looking at an antibiotic agent, and I'm inferring to both the pediatric and the adult population, is that, the drug should be a fairly safe drug, ideally should be tested and trials shown to be safe and effective at the same time in both adults and the pediatric population. A drug that's easy to administer, a drug that's quite tolerable. And I think also another important aspect is that the drug shouldn't need or warrant added therapeutic monitoring. The reason for this in a low middle income setting is that, for example, if we're looking at vancomycin and we do therapeutic drug monitoring, there are many hospitals or institutions that actually don't have those services at the hospital per se. So those tend to be send-away tests. And what tends to happen is that the patients wait for those results, so there's a prolonged turnaround time, and it's also costly for those tests to be run. So we could get a drug that doesn't really require aggressive monitoring, if I can use that term, using added laboratory testing, that actually would be ideal. Another thing would be a drug specifically, if we're looking at serious bacterial infections, generally those are invasive infections, and those infections are generally found within the blood or within the CSF specifically, and patients with those type of infections tend to do poorly or have adverse clinical outcomes. So a drug that is able to penetrate those spaces and be bactericidal, and by that I mean, the bacteria actually kills the drug. That would be a drug that we would consider, for example, bacteremias and meningitis, which actually tend to be a more aggressive infection. So a drug that penetrates those spaces, ideally. A drug that would have minimum side effects, example for those on your gut microbiome, as a drug, for example, clindamycin has quite serious effects on your gut microbiome. So we would ideally like a drug that has minimum effects on that particular aspect. But I think also a drug that is easily accessible to us in a lower middle income setting, something that is cost effective, accessible, but also restricted. And I'm using those two sort of words in the same sentence, but I think restricted for use at the discretion of the clinician, the clinical microbiologist, or the infectious diseases specialist, because that would now equate to responsible antibiotic prescribing, which is where now I'll possibly punt a bit of antibiotic stewardship, but a drug that is accessible, cost effective, and restricted at the same time.
Thank you. And keeping on the theme of access, I'll direct the next question to Manika. You mentioned in your introduction that the GARD-P Venatorx collaboration includes a focus on sustainable access. What does sustainable access look like to you, and how will GARD-P and Venatorx work together on access to cefepime taniborbactam?
Thank you. So I think we need to recognize that the challenges of research and development of new antibiotics are huge. But new drugs alone will not halt the rapid rise of drug-resistant infections. Drugs that are unavailable, insufficient supplies of drugs, and other access challenges will put lives at risk and jeopardize progress. And we have to remember that more people die from lack of access to antibiotics at this present time. Just to give an example of this, of the 25 new antibiotics that entered the market between 1999 and 2014, only 12 were registered in more than 10 countries. So there remains some major challenges when we talk about access. And our vision as an organization in GARD-P is really working for a world where everyone who needs antibiotics receives effective, appropriate, and affordable treatment no matter where they live. And responsible and sustainable access refers to treatments that are of required quality, are affordable for patients and healthcare systems, supplied in a timely and appropriate manner, and with the required stewardship in place to ensure that they are used responsibly to limit the emergence and spread of drug resistance. Now, that is a lot easier said than done, and we recognize that practically huge challenges are on our way to achieve that, which is why in our business plan, GARD-P actually developed an access framework, and we work closely with our partners to do what we can to deliver in that framework and to try and deliver on access. Just practically speaking, GARD-P is working to ensure access to cefepime taniborbactam and its pediatric formulation, especially in low and middle income countries where we see this emerging issue of drug-resistant infections. Through, for example, directly through an exclusive commercialization distribution license for use in the treatment of gram-negative infections. This covers around 67 countries. Also working directly with Venatorx to be responsible for access in the public sector in India and South Africa. This includes registration and distribution and sale of the adult and pediatric treatment in these two countries. And then I think in the remaining territories, more indirectly, but I think we need to work closely with our partner Venatorx to ensure that there's a commercialization strategy that I think will deliver on access, and this will be really working through a joint strategic committee with Venatorx. And I think one of the key parts about going forward with this partnerships is not just that we see a drug that we think has huge potential public health value, but we see a partner we can work with that can also help us deliver on access.
Thank you, Manika. I have a question on why there has historically been a lag in evaluating and approving antibiotics for use with young children. You've talked about the pediatric development. So how does this partnership seek to address this critical gap? Could I actually ask each of you to weigh in on this question? Yogandri, would you like to go first?
I think with many drugs that have been used in pediatrics, around 46 to 50% of those that have been used are off-label use. And we haven't seen clinical trials of these drugs that are used in pediatrics that have come out, and purely because we've inferred the side effects that have been that adults have had to the pediatric population. So it's almost an inference of what's been found in clinical trials in adults and could translate into pediatrics. But I think it's really, really important to take into consideration the pediatric population, because very often, even my daily conversations with the neonatologist at the NICU, you are sort of outweighing the risk-benefit ratio with giving a patient an antibiotic. You're sitting with a result and you are deciding, do I use antibiotic A, knowing very well that these are the known side effects. So if we have to sort of show that a drug is safe in the pediatric population, is effective in treating this type of gram-negative infection, I think it would be actually a huge milestone in medicine in general, you know, just to show that there is a drug, or there are drugs that are available that studies have shown to be safe in the pediatric population. And I think very often neonatologists are faced with very tough decisions about using a certain antibiotic and knowing very well that down the line this could result in renal failure or tendinitis, or even, you know, repercussions on the gut pathology and stuff like that. So I think it's really, really important to go into collaboration and work with sort of companies and people that really hold the pediatric population important in terms of knowing very well that these are the side effects, or this is what we've looked at, and these are the outcomes of the trial, so that many of us that do prescribe these antibiotics on a daily basis to the vulnerable populations can prescribe it now with ease as well, that we may not do harm in trying to do good in treating the patient.
Thank you. Manika?
Yeah, just to say that traditionally it has taken 7 to 10 years after an antibiotic has been registered for use in adults for the pediatric formulation to be made available. It's an expensive process and it takes time, and children have not historically been first in line when it comes to drug development. For this reason, GARD-P will work with Venatorix and other key partners such as the Penta Foundation to conduct the clinical trials required by regulatory authorities such as the European Medicines Agency and the US Food and Drug Administration to gain pediatric approval and do this as fast as we can possibly do it. The information generated for the European Medicines Agency and the FDA will facilitate registration in other settings, including, and this is very important, other low and middle income countries where we see a high infectious disease burden and emerging drug resistance, including the neonatal population. In addition, this collaboration will aim to conduct any strategic public health focused trials on the appropriate use of cefepime-taniborbactam to treat children and babies. And again, that also is very important to guide appropriate use of antibiotics.
Thank you. Chris?
You know, I don't have a lot more to add. You know, obviously the acts in US and Europe in 2003, 2006 have pushed the industries to make sure that pediatrics is part of the equation. But as the other panelists have said, I think it's as much about speed as about intent and efficiency. And we see this collaboration with GARD-P as really important because they have a strong operating experience in pediatrics, and it's something we very highly value at Venatorix. And so I think we're all aligned here, you know, that we want to move quickly and efficiently and get the best people we can on this project to move this quickly into the pediatric realm.
Thank you. And another question for you, Chris. What specific action is Venatorx taking to ensure development work continues on cefepime taniborbactam during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yes. Well, I think like everybody, we're sort of navigating it literally day by day. We're heartened to see that many of our partners around the world are trying to find ways to continue progressing different elements, whether it's the manufacturing, the supply chain, and the clinical trials. We have clinical trials in 16 countries. There are delays. They're modest so far, fortunately, because many centers have other more urgent things on their mind than running clinical trials. However, we're working very closely with all of the different CROs that are our partners around the world, and there are already several groups trying to come back online. So that's encouraging. I think there will be modest delays, but ultimately the project is moving ahead on all the fronts, and I think we'll be in pretty good shape very, very soon.
Thank you. Another question for you, Manika, also related to COVID-19. You have described antibiotic resistance as a health security crisis, like the novel coronavirus. Can you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think basically biology dictates how organisms evolve, particularly when we put pressure on them. And with our growing advances into the previously undisturbed natural world, viruses will continue to jump into human populations with the devastating impact that we're seeing now with COVID-19. But it also means that with the large-scale use and inappropriate use often of antibiotics, bacterial infections will become increasingly drug-resistant. And that's the fact of what we're seeing now. COVID-19, I think, is a wake-up call for the entire global health community. I think ensuring the effective use of antibiotics can save lives now and during future disease outbreaks. We believe there's a clear need to invest further in public health and healthcare systems, as well as collaborative research and development. Antibiotics are the backbone of our ability to respond to disease outbreaks. And with AMR, they're also under threat. So new effective interventions are already needed now, and this demand will only increase.
Thank you very much. Now I have a final question for each of you. If you had to give one message to government leaders and CEOs to prevent drug-resistant infections from becoming the next public health emergency, what would it be? Manika?
I will just reiterate what I've said before. It's important that we develop new treatments to address drug resistance. This cannot be done in isolation. Partnerships are key. And I would like to take the opportunity to thank all our donors who have generally supported this work that we are conducting, work that will be life-saving in the future. But we need more and scaled up versions of these partnerships, and we need them now. We need to bring resources, innovation, and expertise of governments, international agencies, the private sector, academia, and civil society to develop new treatments and ensure their sustainable access.
Thank you. Yogendra?
I think everything that Manika has said is extremely important. And I think the one thing I might add is what I would probably call a South African experience, with HIV, TB, COVID-19, well, whatever we've experienced here in the country. With AMR, I think the very important message here is education and just letting the people on the ground, who are the patients, who are the general population, knowing the sheer disaster that could potentially happen if AMR were allowed to run rampant. Like with HIV and TB, we always put out the message to all members of the public, to the general population, highlighting the importance of treating and managing the infections and getting diagnosed initially. So I think with AMR, it's the same thing, to highlight and to educate the public who are using the antibiotics or who go to the doctor and would want the antimicrobial agent from their general practitioner, to kind of home in to that sort of population and tell them, look, you know what, this is what AMR is, these are the consequences. We won't necessarily actually see it happening, but it is gradual and it's over time. So I think education is really, really important. So governments really need to home in on that, because that's what happened with HIV and TB. And it sort of, I wouldn't say stopped the sort of increase, but it sort of stemmed the tide where there was more awareness. So people became more sort of aware that this is a problem, and if we don't change our behavior and our acts, then it could potentially, you know, get out of hand to a point where there's increased mortality, morbidity, and we won't be able to treat these infections. The other thing that's important is highlighting the fact that antibiotic resistance can't be treated and looked at only as a human problem. It has to be looked at as a problem that extends beyond humans into the environment and into animals. And the use of antimicrobial agents in animals is also a huge problem that's spilling over into the environment that has downstream implications on human health. So I think a multi-sectorial involvement regarding AMR is extremely important. And that actually can only be done at the level of government. So it's important to actually inform policy and procedure of antibiotic use or the banning of antimicrobial agents when it comes to animals and in the environment. The other thing is also looking at auxiliary strategies, or for governments to also pay attention to auxiliary strategies. So research and development into antibiotics is extremely important. It's crucial because our pipeline is coming to an end. But the other important thing is behavioral change, like strategies like antibiotic stewardship, the implementation of these programs. So I myself sit on this committee in the province of KwaZulu-Natal that actually goes out to other public sector hospitals, engaging with various people in trying to set up antibiotic stewardship programs. So governments should actually inform more and more of the public sector and private sector institutions about antibiotic stewardship and using other measures to tackle the problem of AMR, because it's just not about new drugs. New drugs are sort of solution, but we need other sort of players here like antibiotic stewardship and governance and all of that to come in. So those things are extremely important when addressing the entire issue of AMR.
Thank you. Chris?
As you can imagine, this is a topic that we spend a lot of time on. You know, someone who gets up every day and tries to figure out how we're going to survive another day, week, year. I think we've got to get to the point where we acknowledge that the antibiotic space is in a crisis. I mean, we keep talking about it and we keep saying we need to do something, but we haven't done anything. The space is in the middle of what's considered a quote market failure. You know, you have a societal need for new antibiotics, but the economic incentives that are required to innovate and to invest in the space, which is very expensive, are just disconnected. And private investment has dried up. And the pharma groups, the bigger pharma groups, have moved to the sidelines because they can't see how, when they incur a considerable expense to develop, distribute, commercialize an antibiotic, how that makes sense to them when the revenue is very low. And because of that, they've moved out of the space, and the small companies that are trying to survive in the space are increasingly going bankrupt. So when I look at it, I think there are three things we need that are specific. One, we need public policy reforms such as reimbursement reforms, market entry incentives, subscription models, all of which are being discussed, but which have not been finalized, so that you can create visibility to revenue. Without visibility to revenue, there is no carrot for investment. Secondly, pharma at some point has to collectively step up, big pharma, and help support the space. And if that's for no other reason, then it helps their self-interest. Many of their successful drugs assume that there is a trusted, efficient, safe antibiotic as concurrent therapy. When you don't have that, the oncology drugs, the immunology drugs aren't very useful if you don't have an antibiotic as concurrent therapy. And thirdly, and with great thanks to GARD-P and groups like the Wellcome Trust, the Gates Foundation, etc., we need continued support from governments and from non-government organizations such as GARD-P in order to support all the steps, the inventions, the development, and the distribution of new antibiotics. And without really all three, I fear for the future of the space.
Thank you, Chris. That brings us to the end of the question and answer session on the collaboration agreement between GARD-P and Venatorx Pharmaceuticals. I really want to thank all of you for your time today for this session, answering our questions, and especially during this difficult time where we're all doing this from special corners of living rooms and various places where we can be at this time. So thank you very much. We're excited about this collaboration and really appreciate your time today. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
If you would like more information on the collaboration or other updates on GARD-P, you can visit the organization's websites at www.gardp.org or www.venatorx.com.